Justin.
Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for coming along this evening. So we've just had an introduction, a reading from Psalm 83, and it's a prophetic prayer. But before we look at Psalm 83 in any detail, we need to lay down some ground rules. And firstly, this is not a party political presentation on behalf of either an embattled Jewish nation or Gazan freedom fighters. These issues in the Middle East are so deeply polarized that a solution in the current political climate is near impossible. To the Jews who've been persecuted throughout human history, this war in Gaza could be described as a fight for national survival. And for the Gazans, who have been crushed into a tiny piece of land, it's a 70-year-old grudge that is being won on the media platform of the world. So whatever our personal feelings, it's almost impossible not to have them. We've got to be objective about the solution. The problem is, it's war. And war is a sign that reason has departed, and with it goes reasonable debate. And the purpose of this presentation this evening is not to point the finger at one side or the other. We've got to let the Bible speak. And our objective this evening is to understand how the Bible speaks. And one of the main issues in this particular war and in the whole Middle East conflict is, to whom does the land belong? And it's so central an issue that the land has two entirely different names. The other issue is mainly religious. So we've got a toxic mix of politics and religion, the two things you're not supposed to talk about at a dinner party. And they're deeply entrenched in this whole situation. So when this conflict is so polarized that anyone of Jewish nationality is deemed a target, no matter where in the world they might be, it's one step away from primal behavior. Unfortunately, this is where this is leading to. And what happens also is that this fear of persecution amongst the Jews intensifies their reaction. They react more harshly each time. And so the whole situation escalates. And the biggest casualty, sadly, is the truth. Now, Aeschylus, he was an ancient Greek playwright, and he's known as the father of tragedy. He wrote that truth is the first casualty of war. And this is certainly what we're seeing in this conflict. During conflict, truth becomes obscured by propaganda, misinformation, and the chaotic nature of war. So, to return to our question, who does this land of Israel or Palestine really belong to? How can we have an idea in our minds and be objective about this situation? Does it belong to Abram? Now, Abram, he was later renamed Abraham, was called away from a life in a prosperous city in the land which we know as Iraq. He was led to a land many hundreds of miles away, which is situated in this disputed region of Palestine. And here God made a promise to him. And we read this in Genesis 13, verses 14 to 17. The Lord God said to Abram, after Lot had departed from him, lift up your eyes and look from the place where you are, northward and southward, eastward and westward, for all the land that you see, I will give to you and to your offspring forever. I will make your offspring as the dust of the earth, so that if one can count the dust of the earth, your offspring also can be counted. Arise, walk through the length and the breadth of the land, for I will give it you. God said look around. You look northward, look southward, eastward and westward. All the land that you see, I will give it to you and to your offspring. Walk through the land, says God. I'm going to give it to you. And so Abram, who became known as Abraham, goes for a long walk around the land. And clearly what was offered to Abraham was much more than the current land boundary of modern Israel. So Jews can point to scripture and they can say, see, it was given to us by God. But this presents a problem. Here we have the family tree of Abraham, and it's complicated, but they always were. It's the immediate family tree of the man to whom God made this promise. So there's Abraham, who has a son called Isaac, who has a son called Jacob. He has 12 sons, and they become the founders of the Jewish people. So that's the direct line. And those are the people I would call the Jews, who would say, well, God promised the land to our father, Abraham. But the problem then starts with who else came from the same family. Abraham had a son by a slave woman, Hagar, called Ishmael. And he had 12 sons as well, who became Arab tribes. So they can say, well, Abraham is our father, and the land was promised to us as well. But it doesn't stop there. Isaac had 2 sons, Jacob and Esau. And Esau had a family called the tribe of the Edomites. And they're descendants from Abraham as well. And Abraham's nephew, called Lot, had 2 daughters, out of whom came, in rather dubious circumstances, what we now call the Moabite and the Ammonite tribes. So they can't perhaps claim quite so clear a connection, but they are in the same family tree. Now these tribes are the Moabites, and now these tribes who are the Moabites and the Ammonites became what we would call now modern Jordan. We'll see that in a bit. So the point being, a large part of those who claim their lineage from Abraham could reasonably state that the promise God made to Abraham applies to them, because they all claim to be Abraham's offspring. Why should the Jews claim precedence? Well, let's focus for a moment on a much easier question to answer than this question. And that is, to whom does the land belong? But just make a note of those tribal names: Moab, Ammon, Edom, and Ishmael. We'll come back to them in a bit. Now, God gave the man Moses, who descended from Abraham, through the traditional Jewish line, some laws and made promises to a nation. And the laws are amazing. We can't look at them in detail now because there's far too many. But one law is that every 50 years in the nation of Israel, all debts had to be cancelled. All slaves had to be paid off and set free. Every family then was entitled to take back the land that was their inheritance, had they needed to sell it, if they got into financial strife. And there's a very powerful principle at the centre of this. It's recorded in Leviticus 25. The land shall not be sold forever, for the land is mine, and ye are strangers and sojourners with me. God said the land shall not be sold forever, because the land belongs to God. And you, says God to the Jews, are strangers and sojourners. Or in modern terms, you're my guests. You are custodians of the land. So don't forget who the land really belongs to. And this point cuts through centuries of fighting over ownership. The land of Palestine, or Israel, does not belong to the Israeli war machine or Arab factions. intent on murder. So who then will receive the land? Who's God going to really give it to? And keep that question in the back of your mind, because we will return to it later. And the second ground rule that we want to look at tonight is we need to examine, or the rule we need to examine before diving into our reading, is what is Bible prophecy? We can't just grab a passage out of thin air and say, this is what we're going to talk about. We need to understand its context and how it works. Because when you speak to some people about prophecy, they think of Nostradamus, who utters some rather carefully crafted generalizations that could, in all honesty, apply to any event. The Bible, on the other hand, has hard and fast rules about prophecy. In the Bible, for a prophet to speak in the name of God, they had to establish their credentials. They had to show that they can predict the future or far distant future by accurately predicting something in a much more immediate time frame. And in Deuteronomy 18, you read about this. God is addressing this very issue. And he says in Deuteronomy 18, and if you say in your heart, how may we know the word that the Lord has not spoken? In other words, how can we distinguish between a genuine prophet and a false prophet? Well, God gives them the solution. When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the word does not come to pass or come true, that is a word that the Lord has not spoken. The prophet has spoken it presumptuously. When a prophet speaks in the name of the Lord, if the thing that prophet predicts doesn't happen or come to pass, then that is the thing which the Lord has not spoken. He's spoken presumptuously. Take no notice of him. Having then shown that the Lord has indeed spoken through a man or a woman, by seeing that what the man or woman prophesied come to pass, the hearer can then say, this is a genuine prophet, and they can therefore believe their long-term prophecies. So a short time frame prophecy provided a prophet's credentials of being a genuine prophet and gave the hearers confidence that what he or she prophesied in a long-term time frame would come to pass. Bible prophecy has a notable feature, and we can be confident that it will always be the same way. The prophet speaks of things near in time to those around him, and then confusingly, sometimes seamlessly, goes on to speak about things in the far distant future. Words spoken that quite possibly have even yet to be fulfilled today. We have an example of this with King David. King David was approached by a prophet called Nathan with a prophecy from God. He said this, when your days are fulfilled and you lie down with your fathers, I will raise up your offspring after you, who shall come from your body, and I will establish his kingdom. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. I will be to him a father, and he shall be to me a son. So who is this descendant of David that God will be to him as a father, and he will be to God as a son? We were told who this is in 1 Chronicles chapter 28, where it's recorded, and of all my sons, this is David speaking, for the Lord has given me many sons, he has chosen Solomon my son to sit on the throne of the kingdom of the Lord over Israel. He said to me, it is Solomon your son who shall build my house and my courts, for I have chosen him to be my son, and I will be his father. So the short-term fulfillment was going to be that Solomon, David's son, would build a temple for the Lord. But remember the words that Nathan spoke from God to David in 2 Samuel 7. He shall build a house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And where's the throne of King Solomon today? It no longer exists. But clearly this prophecy spoken to King David through Nathan the prophet, was only partially fulfilled in Solomon. For a kingdom to be established forever, it's a kingdom that has no end. This is a prophecy that has a long-term fulfillment, and we can have confidence in that happening because the short-term fulfillment has happened. So let's summarize what we've covered so far. Firstly, we're not political in our outlook. Secondly, we've seen that the land of Israel or Palestine belongs to God and will be given to those who deserve it. We will look further into that later. And then thirdly, we looked at a few features that make Bible prophecy trustworthy. Namely, that a short-term fulfillment gives us confidence that a long-term time frame fulfillment will happen. So we must approach prophecy with a mingled sense of awe and humility. So does this mean that we can avoid educated conjecture? Well, of course not. About 30% of the Bible is prophecy in one way, shape, or form. So God obviously thinks a lot of prophecy. And he tells us through the prophet Amos these words: "For the Lord God does nothing without revealing his secret to his servants, the prophets." So God has shown us future events so that we can gain confidence and assurance that whilst it looks as though our world is spiraling into disaster, it is in fact heading in a direction long ago revealed to men. Let's now look at our reading and try and understand what is happening. But before we look at this in detail, if you have an authorized version of the Bible, you'll see at the top that it says a song or Psalm of Asaph. This psalm was written by a man named Asaph. So who was Asaph? In 2 Chronicles 29 verse 13, it's recorded that the Levites gave praise unto the Lord with the words of David and of Asaph the seer. Now, a seer is another name for a prophet. So Asaph was a prophet. So, Psalm 83, in verse 1. O God, do not keep silence. Do not hold your peace or be still, O God. This is a prayer. It's an appeal to God to act on their behalf. Now remember what we said. For a prophet to be deemed as legitimate and not a fraud, he or she would give a short-term prophecy. And if it had a reasonably immediate fulfillment, then we can say, yes, this is prophetic. And we can have faith in the prophet's long-term time frame prophecies. So in the psalm, is there a short-term fulfillment? An Old Testament situation? Or is it unique? Or is it uniquely applicable to our day? In which case we can argue about whether it's authentic or not. Well, we have a possible contender in the book of 2 Chronicles chapter 20, and we'll go there. In 2 Chronicles chapter 20, verses 1 to 4. After this, the Moabites and Ammonites, and with them some of the Meunites, came against Jehoshaphat to battle. Some men came and told Jehoshaphat, "A great multitude has come against you from Edom, from beyond the sea." Then Jehoshaphat was afraid and set his face to seek the Lord and proclaimed a fast throughout all Judah. And Judah assembled to seek help from the Lord. From all the cities of Judah they came to seek the Lord. So there's an appeal. And this psalm starts with an appeal. But Jehoshaphat complains to God. And he says, "And now behold, the men of Ammon and Moab and Mount Seir, whom you would not let Israel invade when they came from the land of Egypt, and whom they avoided and did not destroy, behold, they reward us by coming to drive us out of your possession, which you have given us to inherit." So Jehoshaphat complains that when Israel came out of the land of Egypt and destroyed the inhabitants of the land, when they entered the promised land, God forbade them to destroy the inhabitants of Ammon, Moab, and Mount Seir. But now the exact people they spared are coming to drive them out of the possession that God promised them. The intentions of this aggressive army coming against Jehoshaphat is to throw Judah out of the land. That same intention is in Psalm 83. Let us wipe them out as a nation, so that they may be remembered no more. Verse 12, let us take possession for ourselves of the pastures of God. So this psalm is echoing that intention found in 2 Chronicles chapter 20. Notice also who is coming to attack Judah. After this, the Moabites and Ammonites, and with them some of the Meunites, came against Jehoshaphat to battle. Some men came and told Jehoshaphat, "A great multitude has come against you from Edom, from beyond the sea. And now, behold, the men of Ammon and Moab and Mount Seir." We read that it's the children of Moab and the Ammonites, and a great multitude from beyond the sea on this side Syria, and also the men of Ammon and Mount Seir. The people of Mount Seir were descendants of Esau, Abraham's grandson. They dwelt in Mount Seir, and Mount Seir is in Edom. So there's a big confederation. Ammon, Ammonites, Moabites, and the Edomites. And they're coming against King Jehoshaphat and Judah with the stated intention of destroying it. Now, look at the nations mentioned in Psalm 83. The tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites, Moab and the Hagarites, Gebal and Ammon and Amalek, Philistia with the inhabitants of Tyre. Asher also has joined them. And there they are, the tents of Edom and the Ishmaelites, Moab, the Hagarites, Gebal and Ammon and Amalek. The same nation spoken of in 2 Chronicles 20 and are all mentioned in this psalm. So let's look at these names listed here in verse 6 to 8 of Psalm 83, and let's look at a modern day map and compare where these nations were located when Asaph wrote this psalm. So we've got a map of the nations around Israel as we see them on a map today. And we've got Gebal, which was up in Lebanon. We've got the inhabitants of Tyre, which is up in Lebanon as well. Assyria, we have the inhabitants of Assyria, which at the time of Asaph wrote were the equivalent of Syria and Iraq. We have Ammon, Moab, and Edom. These were the northern, central, and southern Jordan. Edomites made their way into Israel, so you had Idumeans, which is the Greek word for Edomites. It's interesting to note that the capital of Jordan is now called Amman. It's the city place of the kingdom of Ammon. We've got Amalek. Amalek was the Arabs of the Sinai Peninsula. We've got the Ishmaelites. Ishmael was the father of the Arabs, the nation which was promised to come out of his loins. And the Ishmaelites inhabited the region that we now know as Saudi Arabia. We've got the Hagarenes or Hagarites. Hagar was the Egyptian matriarch she was the mother of Ishmael. And finally, we've got Philistia. And Philistia, which was the Philistine territory, and as we all well know, the region of Gaza. So when was this psalm written? Well, it was written in the time of King David, because Asaph was the choir master of David, and he wrote this psalm, or was inspired to write it by God, about 1000 BC. And Jehoshaphat, the king we've mentioned in 2 Chronicles, reigned from 870 to 849 BC. He was a couple of hundred years after Asaph. And so this prayer would have been well known by the time of Jehoshaphat. So when this army comes against him, Jehoshaphat would have said, where's that prayer where God had predicted this would happen? He finds the psalm and he starts to quote it to God. God, don't hold your peace. Do something about this. And he throws his entire burden on God. Jehoshaphat would have read what Asaph wrote in Psalm 83, verse 9, where we read, do to them as you did to Midian. And what was done to Midian? Well, much further back in Israel's history, in the time of a man named Gideon, the Midianites were occupying the land and destroying it. And Gideon, with 300 men, surrounded the camp, and they set off a series of torches and blew trumpets and panicked the Midianites. And that panic caused the Midianites to fight amongst themselves, and a lot of them died at the hand of their own swords. So this psalm says, God, do that to them again. So we can see how this psalm, written at the time of David, 150 years later, inspires Jehoshaphat and his people to stand firm against his invasion. And what was the outcome for King Jehoshaphat and the people of Judah? We're told later in 2 Chronicles 20 what happened. And they rose early on the morning and went out into the wilderness of Tekoa. And when they began to sing and praise, the Lord set an ambush against the men of Ammon, Moab, and Mount Seir, who had come against Judah, so that they were routed. For the men of Ammon and Moab rose against the inhabitants of Mount Seir, devoting them to destruction. And when they had made an end of the inhabitants of Seir, they all helped to destroy one another. So in the time of Jehoshaphat, the incoming armies were wiped out by God. He panicked them and they killed each other. So it's exactly the same outcome as in the time of Gideon, which the psalm references. So we have a short-term fulfillment of this Psalm 83 in 2 Chronicles 20. The psalm is prophetic, and we can place and trust in this prophecy. So what actually happens in the psalm? Well, reading verse 2. For behold, your enemies make an uproar. Those who hate you have raised their heads. Is there a better word than uproar for the outrage that is moving around the world at the moment? Streets are clogged with angry flag-waving demonstrators. The world is in an uproar. And at the center of it is the Arab-Israeli conflict. And what are these aggressors of Israel saying? What's their stated intention? Well, verse 4. They say, come, let us wipe them out as a nation. Let the name of Israel be remembered no more. Is this what's been happening in the Middle East? Well, we have, this is what the late leader Ismail Haniyeh said. He was the political leader of Hamas until his assassination in July 2024. And he publicly stated that the Islamic resistance movement believes that the land of Palestine, this disputed territory, is an Islamic endowment consecrated for future Muslim generations until Judgment Day. It doesn't belong to the Jews, is essentially what he's saying. And it is the individual duty of every Muslim in the face of the Jews' usurpation of Palestine that the banner of jihad or holy war be raised. And these are strong words. But compared to what Hezbollah, the Lebanon section, are saying, his words are tame. And this is the Hezbollah manifesto. The elimination of the state of Israel has been the primary goal of Hezbollah. Our struggle will end only when this entity, Israel, is obliterated. We recognize no treaty with it, no ceasefire, no peace agreements. The elimination of Israel will bring peace in the Middle East. There is no solution to this conflict in this region except with the disappearance of Israel. So that's strong stuff. That's like saying all Europeans in New Zealand must be wiped out. And it also occurs with disturbing accuracy with our psalm, because there in Psalm 83, verse 4, they say, "Come, let us wipe them out as a nation. Let the name of Israel be remembered no more." So what other observations can we make from this remarkable psalm? Let's read on. Verse 3 and 5. They lay crafty plans against your people. They consult together against your treasured ones, for they conspire with one accord against you. They make a covenant. So this is no sudden rush into an all-out war. It's been planned covertly and painstakingly. October the 7th didn't just happen because a group of Arabs got together and decided to go slaughtering. It was well and truly planned, even to knocking out Israel's defences. And these nations, these 10 nations with major differences in outlook and religious belief, are in this psalm. They're together at last, united in one desire that overwhelms all their differences. Come, they say, let us wipe Israel out as a nation. Israel is, to the other family members of the descendants of Abraham, like a piece of grit in the oyster. And this psalm is a supplication to God by Israel, begging him to intervene on their behalf, to vindicate his name. So let's summarize what we know about this psalm. It has a limited fulfillment in the 8th century BC under Jehoshaphat that sets its authority, and the modern fulfillment is an attack by Israel's immediate neighbours. It's coordinated and planned. The Confederates almost surround Israel. The response of the nation in their prayer suggests that they are unable to cope with the onslaught, and its purpose is to exterminate the nation and take the land. What clue do we have to tell us that Psalm 83 is now and appropriate to our time? Well, here we have a map of the Middle East in 1744, drawn by the French. And something's missing. You'll see there's no Israel. There's no Jewish presence there. It's called entirely different names. It's a caliphate. And we can go in both directions, back to AD 70 and forward to 1948. And throughout that whole 2,000-year period, there was no nation to be on the receiving end of such a war described in Psalm 83. So a prophecy, Psalm 83, is dormant until the Jews are back in that piece of land, because otherwise they can't be under threat to be driven from it. And the Bible tells us in many places that the Jews would return to their land. Here are just two instances. Jeremiah 31 verse 10, Hear the word of the Lord, O nations, and declare it in the coastlands far away. Say, he who scattered Israel will gather him, and will keep him as a shepherd keeps his flock. And again in Jeremiah 32, behold, I will gather them from all the countries to which I drove them in my anger and my wrath and in great indignation. I will bring them back to this place, and I will make them dwell safely. There's also something very odd about the psalm, and it's in the list of the enemies of Israel in verses 6 to 8. There's something missing. There is a nation who should be there alongside the nations warring against Israel. Now, some people argue that Assur is part of Syria. But at the time of the writing of the psalm, and for most of the Old Testament, Syria was a nation on its own right. But it's not mentioned. It's missing. So we have to conclude it's not taking part in this attack on Israel. Nowhere in all the places in the Old Testament do you read of Syria being in anything other than a skirmish or all-out war with Israel. So what's happened to Syria? Where have they gone? Why are they not listed in Psalm 83? And we might find an answer from another prophecy, and it's in Isaiah 17. I've rearranged it slightly, but it's an oracle concerning Damascus. And very often when a capital city is mentioned, it encompasses the whole of a nation. So Jerusalem is mentioned, talking about the whole of Israel. So with Damascus, we talk about the nation of Syria. And it says in Isaiah 17, behold, Damascus is taken away from being a city, and it shall be a ruinous heap. In that day it shall come to pass that the glory of Jacob, or Israel, shall be made thin, and the fatness of his flesh shall wax lean. So it's going to be deprived, being thin. So the language here is as if something dramatic has happened to these two nations simultaneously. Israel has been weakened, made thin, and Damascus has been destroyed, a ruinous heap. And the prophecy continues. The fortress also shall cease from Ephraim, and the kingdom of Damascus from Damascus, and the remnant of Syria, they shall be as the glory of the children of Israel. Meaning they're going to be pounded as well. So Ephraim, which is in central Israel, north of Jerusalem, and the fortress has gone. It means it can't defend itself. It's weak and open to and exposed. But Syria, at the same time, is afflicted, so that the two nations are struck down together. So what's happened? What can have happened to have caused this? Well, let's look at another prophecy in Jeremiah 49. In Jeremiah 49, verse 24 to 26, it says, Damascus has become feeble. She turned to flee, and panic seized her. Anguish and sorrows have taken hold of her, as a woman in labor. How is the famous city not forsaken, the city of my joy? Therefore her young men shall fall in her squares, and all her soldiers shall be destroyed in that day. It's interesting that terminology is likened to the onset of labor in a woman. And this comparison is very often used about end times. It's a situation that can only go one way. Once a woman is in labor, there's no turning back. It cannot be reversed. And the suggestion we want to make is that at some point, this situation is going to happen, possibly as a result of all-out war between Israel and Syria, and both sides are going to be seriously weakened. This will leave Syria destroyed, and Israel severely weakened and much more vulnerable to this 10-nation confederacy mentioned in Psalm 83. Not long after the October 7 war began, speculation turned to whether Israel would use its nuclear weapons it apparently doesn't have. This was in light of what happened in 1973 during the Yom Kippur War. Things took a turn for the worse, and Israel had their backs to the wall. They were being attacked from the north by Syria, from the southwest by Egypt, and the east by Jordan. And then something happened. And the American and the Russian spotter planes picked up the traces of Israel deploying its nuclear weapons. Now, this was recorded on the website for the Centre of Arms Control and Non-Proliferation in November 16th, 2022. So 49 years later, this was finally posted. 3 days into the conflict, the Israeli Prime Minister ordered the country's nuclear strike planes and missiles to go on high alert after severe battlefield defeats. Egyptian and Syrian forces successfully broke through Israeli defences on the Sinai Peninsula and near the Golan Heights. These advances and the fear of a nuclear war led to the United States to supply its ally with material, including aeroplanes, helicopters, tanks, missile systems, artillery, and ammunition to replace its conventional losses. In response, Moscow began supplying the same to Egypt and Syria. It's amazing. This has only come to light 49 years later. So Israel has a policy called the Samson option. Because if you know the story of Samson, at the very end, he gets hold of the central pillars in the house of Dagon, which is full of Philistines, and he collapses them on himself, killing himself and all the Philistines. And that's Israel's stated intention. If we're going to go down, we're going to take you all with us. And the concern was that if Israel were pushed to the same point that they were during the Yom Kippur War, would they use nuclear weapons? So the question has to be asked, how did we get to this? That if these sorts of weapons are going to be used in a tense situation, what's going to be the repercussions for the world and your and my future? It's probably no overstatement to say that should this happen, the future of humanity is in jeopardy. The greatest prophet ever, Jesus Christ, warned us about these end times in Matthew 24, where he said, "And if those days had not been cut short, no human being would be saved. But for the sake of the elect, those days will be cut short." This evening, we've only looked at a small part of unfolding prophetic tragedy, which human hatred is going to unleash on our already overburdened planet. The events which follow are a jigsaw puzzle of prophecies uttered centuries ago. But the story they tell together is sobering. And the prophet Daniel, in Daniel chapter 12, verse 1, said, "And there shall be a time of trouble such as never has been since there was a nation." Unless God, in his mercy, cuts short or brings things to a premature end, the survival of the human race will be in jeopardy. And Daniel's prophecy tells us this will be a time of unparalleled trouble. And Jesus echoes this 6 centuries later when he said in Matthew 24, "For then there will be great tribulation, such as has not been from the beginning of the world until now. No, and never will be." So what can we do? What can we put our trust in that will give us peace of mind while living in a world which Jesus Christ, the greatest prophet ever, foretold would end in troublesome times? Well, let's take Jesus' advice when he said, "Now when these things begin to take place, straighten up, raise up your heads, because your redemption is drawing near." When these things begin to happen, says Jesus, Look up. Don't look at the earth, because it's not what you really want to see. What's going on out there? Look up. Lift up your heads, because your redemption draws near. Look up beyond the earth to heaven, from whence will return the Lord Jesus Christ to save the world. But how do we know we can believe this? Well, Psalm 83, which we've looked at tonight, was written in 1000 BC. A man called Asaph writes a prayer that resonates powerfully with our world today. He references a Jewish nation that should have long ceased to exist. And 3,000 years later, he's back with us. He speaks of intentions that we can hear being chanted in our world today. From the river to the sea, they cry, Palestine shall be free. How on earth could Asaph have done that? Well, Asaph was inspired by God. And God says in Isaiah 46, I am God, and there is none like me, declaring the end from the beginning, and from ancient times, things not yet done. Now, while the content of this prophecy is obviously horrifying, we need to step back and think about the implications. This prayer proves not only that there is a God who could inspire a musician to write such a detailed forecast of a situation further on in human history, but it also tells us that God is exerting control over human affairs, so that whatever happens, we can trust his judgment and actions. Now, Abraham, the man originally mentioned at the beginning of our presentation, trusted God and was infinitely the better for it. Jehoshaphat, the king to whom the psalm first applied, trusted God and did not need to lift a finger for himself. And we can trust God. The Bible word for it is called faith, and it can help in our lives, even in these terribly anxious times. And we can be assured that the end that God has declared will be worth the wait. And to see this end, we need to return to the beginning of our talk tonight. God said to Abraham, look around you, I'm going to give you this land. So did God fulfill that prophecy to Abraham? Well, there was a man called Stephen in the book of Acts who said otherwise. Yet he gave him no inheritance in it, not even a foot's length, but promised to give it to him as a possession and to his offspring after him, though he had no child. Now, is this prophecy promised to Abraham being fulfilled in the bitter hatred shown by these descendants of Abraham, slaughtering each other? Is this really what God meant? No, says another writer in the New Testament. The Apostle Paul, he wrote, if you are Christ's, then are you Abraham's offspring, heirs according to the promise. If you be Christ's, if you commit your life to Christ and being in belief and in baptism and living a life of faith, you are Abraham's seed. Not just the physical Jews and the Arabs, you are Abraham's seed. You can inherit that promise. You can inherit the land that God promised to Abraham. You, me, and countless others who commit our lives to serving Jesus Christ have been offered this promise that God made to Abraham. This kingdom that will be set up, ruled over by Jesus Christ, will spread out from this land of Palestine to the four corners of the earth to bring peace and righteousness to this broken world. The promises to Abraham will find their ultimate fulfillment in you and me. And how do we know this? Well, it is in the promise God made to Abraham. He said to Abraham, I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you will be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you I will curse. And in all and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And what will happen to the world? Well, a lot of things. But let's finish on a positive note. There's something going to be missing from the New World Order that we take so much for granted in our day and age. Israel currently relies on ultra-sophisticated weaponry to guard its people. Each interceptor rocket of the Iron Dome costs around $50,000. That's a lot of money. And so you can see why Israel's enemies put together a cheap homemade rocket and fire it, because the Iron Dome will pick it off and shoot it down. And that's another $50,000 wasted. And they can't afford to keep doing that. All this money spent on killing and self-defense, how much cheaper it would be if we learn to love our enemies. Well, one day this madness will end because Jesus will intervene. The earth belongs to God. He will give it to those who deserve to have it. And the planet's suffering will be over. And this is where you come in. Through faith, if you become the children of Abraham, you can have a part in this new era. He, that's Christ, shall judge between many people, and they shall beat their swords into plowshares and their spears into pruning hooks. Nation shall not lift up sword against nation, neither shall they learn war anymore.